3CR Radiothon 2024 Sound On for Solidarity.
Coming up is a podcast brought to you by the dedicated and diverse volunteers at 3CR. Just a quick message before you get there. For the month of June, we're asking listeners to donate to the station to help keep us going. We rely on the generous donations of the community to survive. Go to 3cr.org.au/donate and show your support for community-owned and community-run media. Thanks for your support and happy listening.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. In the fields of bodies burning, as the war machine keeps turning. Death and hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed mind.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia on the National Community Radio Satellite. Listen to the Anarchist World This Week, Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. Listen to analysis of local, national, international events. Listen to analysis you'll never hear anywhere else.
Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week. Yes, we're super excited. The ground, that's right, is pregnant for change. That's the producer walking out. She's kind of doesn't understand. She doesn't understand anything. But the ground is pregnant for change. If you wonder what anarchy is all about, anarchos without rulers. A society without rulers, not without rules. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions, not millions anymore, but billions of people around the planet? Inequalities in power and wealth. So what is the anarchist struggle? The struggle to devolve, that's share power, possibly for direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Exceptionally conservative concepts, but considering the people who exercise power and control wealth in our society, it's a massive struggle. It's a struggle that's been carried on since time immemorial. Sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, but the important thing is to keep the ideas alive. So if you're involved in that struggle, whether you call yourself an anarchist or not, you're an anarchist. Sorry to tell you that. Don't look behind you. You may see a tail growing from your bottom. Obviously, you're part of the devil's spawn. Right. That's the sarcasm for the day. As I said, the ground is pregnant for change. What do I mean by that? Well, we have an exceptionally desolate Australian political, social and cultural landscape. It's parched. Lack of ideas of how to go forward. Lack of anything. It's a really desolate landscape. And what I've noticed, and I've been around a long time, like most of the listeners to this program, what I've noticed over the last 6 to 12 months is droplets of hope are beginning to fall on this parched, desolate Australian political, social and cultural landscape. What do I mean by that? Well, as you know, cynicism is the lifeblood of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution and exchange. And that hope, the love child, desire and expectation, is what we are about. The desire for change and the expectation that change will occur. And obviously in any situation, things change, and sometimes they change quite rapidly. Much more rapidly than we think. And this change is driven by a feeling of hopelessness, not cynicism that change is impossible, but a feeling of hopelessness. That all the institutions which are theoretically there in a social democracy or a parliamentary democracy to look after the interests of the people have been colonised, taken over but not just the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, but the investment class, that 8% of Australians who've got disposable income and able to use this country's investment-friendly laws to increase their wealth. The fact is, irrespective of a minuscule wage rise for the most lowly paid workers in this country from the so-called Fair Work Commission, the fact is that as far as the situation is concerned for the majority of people in this country, it's beginning to look as if the future is bleak. We have the climate emergency as a result of allowing an ideology which has now become a religion in a secular society, the religion that private investment for private profit is the only way that a society can be organised. We use this over and over again. There is no other way. It's all about private investment for private profit. And as you know, we've now got to the ridiculous situation where corporate welfare seems to be the government's main aim in terms of governing. And if the Labor Party believes that it's ensconced in power for years to come, the fact is that their primary vote was at the very lowest it had ever been since the party was formed at the end of the 19th century. I think it was about 33% at the last election. It was through the preferences of more reformist-orientated political parties like the Greens that they're actually able to exercise a modicum of power. Not much, enough. So what are these droplets of hope I'm talking about? Well, as you know, the traditional way of people improving their situation in our society has been through workplace activity, through collective bargaining, through mutual aid, through solidarity. But what we've seen in the last 40 to 50 years, especially in the last 30 years, is the passage of legislation through federal parliament that has not only privatised most of the essential services in this country, but has actually removed the power of workers, wage earners, to withdraw their labour, strike, collectively bargain. In 2024, 190 years after the Tolpuddle martyrs were transported to Australia for forming a friendly society of agricultural labourers in Tolpuddle, in Dorchester in England, southern England, we have almost as few rights as they did in terms of withdrawing your labour. If you withdraw your labour outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period, it's illegal. I mean, we like to jump up and down about authoritarian states where, trade unions are illegal. But the fact is we've gone one step further in this country. We've kept the skeletal structure of a trade union movement, but have actually changed legislation in such a way that very few Australians are now members of trade unions, outside possibly the construction industry and state and federal public servants. And we're looking about, 12, 15% of the workforce is now unionised. But at the same time, legislation has been passed which makes it almost impossible to withdraw your labour without significant financial and penal penalties. Now, I remember in the late 60s when Clary O'Shea, I think he was the secretary of the Tramways Union in Melbourne, was jailed, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. I don't believe that in 2024 you'd see more than 2,000 or 3,000 people taking to the street if a trade unionist was jailed for taking strike action outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period. Because the culture has changed, society has changed, politics has changed in terms of concentrating power in fewer and fewer hands. But the reality is that in 2024, that myth that has been created, that the only way to achieve security and overcome income disparity and have a more egalitarian community is through waiting for a few crumbs to be brushed off the corporate table in our direction has come and gone. Because most people have little faith in the democratic process. They'll march out and, cast a ballot because it's their legal responsibility. Very few countries in the world have a legal responsibility that people should cast a ballot. But the fact is that changing circumstances, especially for younger people in this country, and especially for people on social security benefits, are beginning to erode the idea that the only way forward is through privatisation and corporatisation and globalisation and deregulation. Because 40 years of this garbage has concentrated wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands on every available social index that you care to look at. And now we are reaping the benefits. And that's why I say the ground is pregnant for change. Because the social, cultural, political framework this country is based on is so desolate that people are looking for ways out of the situation they find themselves in. So the possibility of reform is high on the agenda. Obviously the possibility of revolution isn't. But significant reform is high on the agenda. So what do? Do we get mad or do we organise? Well, the state loves us to get mad. Because it's very simple. You get mad, you do stupid things, the state steps in, the corporate-owned media and the government guild at ABC jump on the bandwagon, and the devil incarnate has now appeared in Australian society. That's you and me, The courts go swing into actions. The financial penalties drop on us. The jails open. And the Prime Minister screams, it's all under control. We've got the uncontrollables under control. So you get mad. You may have, a day or two of satisfaction. But the fact is, you're much more likely to achieve results by organising. It's very easy to pick a few heads that have bobbed above the parapet when people are involved in a riot. But it's much more difficult to actually overcome an organised movement. A movement that has goals and ambitions like a universal basic income. Goals and ambitions which are not based on gender politics or racial politics or, dog whistling, all these aspects of our society which allows us to fight amongst each other while those with power just laugh, looking at the idiots fighting amongst themselves because of these differences. Now, I've been involved in various capacities with, as well as being a foundation member of public interest before corporate interest. It's not a revolutionary organisation. It's a reform-based organisation. We're interested in the electoral process, and we're also interested in extra-parliamentary activities. The organisation is beginning to move forward. But unfortunately, like all situations, we need more people to become involved. And I encourage you to have a look at the webpage, PIBCI, PIBCI.net, public interest before corporate interest. Why should we allow the few to set the political agenda, the social agenda, the cultural agenda at the expense of the many? What I'm speaking about is nothing new. It's part of human history. But every dog has its day. And I'm coming round to the idea, not belief's a load of bullshit, but the idea that change is not only possible, but probable. What type of change we have, whether it's more authoritarian, whether it's more egalitarian, is dependent on us being able to organise around issues of equality, issues of power, issues of different ways of making decisions, issues of ensuring that this country's resources, if they are to be exploited, they're exploited for the benefit of First Nations people and the rest of us, not unaccountable corporations whose major responsibility is to make ever-increasing profits for their major shareholders. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. As I said, I think I said at the beginning of the program, I may not have, who knows. Next week is a special week here at Community Radio 3CR, where this program is coming to you from in the rest of Australia. It's our Radiothon week, and I'll be doing a special Radiothon program for the listeners of 3CR, but at the same time, I'll be pre-recording a program for the rest of the listeners, because obviously every community radio station in this state, in this country, I should say, in this state and in this country, has its own financial issues. And it's important that if you're listening to this program via community radio station, via the community radio network, irrespective of where you are in Australia, that you contact your local community radio station, offer it to assist, either as a volunteer, financial assistance, whatever. Because people say, well, broadcasting is dead. Broadcasting isn't dead. There may be hundreds of thousands of boring, meaningless podcasts out there, but the fact is that broadcasting to people is not dead. It does have significant benefits in terms of expanding not only the ideas that people are willing to look at, but expanding the possibility of organising mutually in order to introduce major reforms in this society, whether it's through direct action or parliamentary politics. Unfortunately, the younger you are, the more difficult life has become. For far too long, the private investment for private profit crowd has manipulated the political processes, the cultural processes and the social processes in this country. And now we find people who believe they have no future in this country, the richest, resource-richest country on the planet. No future. It's just an extraordinary situation we find ourselves in, because for far too long we have accepted that premise that the only way forward is through private investment. Let's move on. Sometimes you've got to laugh. Sometimes I laugh. I have to laugh. Now, I noticed that our defence minister, I think he is, or the foreign minister, I can't keep up with these people, was lecturing the Chinese government about a rules-based order. All right? So, naughty, 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 you got to do the rules-based order. Now, don't think that I support the Chinese Communist Party. Far, far, far from it. But I find it hilarious when our defence minister, yes, it is the defence minister, Penny Wong is the foreign minister, lectures China about a rules-based order. And I look at the carnage in Gaza and this country's non-reaction to that carnage. No recalling the Australian ambassador from Israel. No banning military support for Israel. When the International Criminal Court made its decision to issue arrest warrants for Mr. Netanyahu and his defence minister and some Hamas leaders, no reaction. And now we have the United States Congress passing legislation in the last 24 hours, not binding, to actually admonish the International Criminal Justice Commission for issuing arrest warrants against the Israeli Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, obviously making no comments about the arrest warrants against the 3 Hamas leaders that are named in those arrest warrants. And they talk about a rules-based order as far as defence is concerned. What a joke. What a joke. Obviously, if it's in our interests or our allies' interests, it's never in our interests. I mean, we're more busy, pandering to US foreign policy and US, imperial ambitions than actually being involved in dialogue and discussions with our neighbours, because, I may be stupid, and you may, and people may say you're stupid for listening to this program, but the fact is, I don't know of a ship that's big enough to tow the Australian continent to the east coast of the US of A. All right? What are you talking about, Joe? You say? Well, it's very simple. We're acting as a nation, our political leadership, as a nation, as if we are the 52nd state of the US of A. Because everything we do in terms of defence policy, whether it's the US bases at Pine Gap or Darwin or other parts of this country, as I've spoken about before, the fact is that we seem to have no interest in developing an independent foreign policies. Unlike our near neighbours, Indonesia, where their president-elect suggested that Indonesia would be very happy to send troops to Gaza if the United Nations passed a resolution that troops needed to keep the warring parties, United Nations were needed to keep the warring parties apart. Not in this country. We see Bowen, Chris Bowen, the Defence Minister, lecturing China on a rules-based order. The fact is that as far as our defence capabilities and our defence ambitions, it's centred around supporting United States foreign policy, because we think, you and I think, well, I don't, neither do you, but most of Australians think that if the unthinkable happens and World War III breaks out, that the United States would run over here and support us to the hilt. The fact is, as we saw in Vietnam, as we saw in Afghanistan, as we saw in Iraq, as we see everywhere the going gets tough, the United States gets going. Because the United States policy, as we saw in the beginning of World War II until it was attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, is about the United States. That's fair enough. And that means that our foreign policy should be about us, about the people in this country, about the alliances we make with the people around us in order to avert a possible war. I know it sounds a bit dramatic, but I'm sure if you were alive in 1914, and nobody's alive from that period these days that I know of, you wouldn't have believed that World War One would have broken out. But there were all these alliances, and before you knew it, all the dominoes had fallen down, and bingo, we found ourselves at war. And if you think we don't find ourselves at war supporting the United States, what was the Vietnam War about? I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War and the marbles, in the barrel when kids were sent off to be slaughtered in Vietnam, to cement the Australian military alliance. I'm old enough to remember, I'm even old enough just to remember the Korean War. And then we've got the war in Iraq. John Howard's crowning moment as our beloved Prime Minister. The fact is, you see, we have a very interesting system of government where the Prime Minister, without consultation with his inner cabinet, let alone cabinet and parliament, can declare war. Fascinating. We're still looking for those weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, aren't we? 1 million dead and we're still looking. Ah, well. But being serious, what we have seen, and it's been exceptionally successful because I was listening to yes, I do listen to radio occasionally, a program where one of the think tanks in this country, it escapes one of the prominent think tanks, actually for a number of years has kept an eye on Australians' attitudes. And one of the questions they asked is, do you trust China? And about 5 or 6 years ago, I was over 50%. Today it's down to 17%. So obviously, the propaganda of the Chinese government is a major threat to Australia. Not the USA, but a major threat to Australia, has been accepted by a significant majority of people in this country. When we hear the Defence Minister talk about changing the categories of people who can join the Australian Armed Forces because, believe it or not, Australians, seem to be too smart to actually enter the Australian Armed Forces, especially when they know the Australian Armed Forces is nothing more than an extension of US military power around the world. So we're going to allow non-citizens? Why don't we just hire some mercenaries while other people do, eh? Just kidding, kids. But what is important is what we are seeing is that we are being groomed, Sexual predators groom their victims. We are, as a people, are being groomed for an upcoming war with China, as China and the US juggle for economic supremacy, nudge each other. And as we see in the Ukraine, proxy wars are all the go. We saw that in the 70s and 80s. Proxy wars. We see it in the Middle East. Proxy wars. Where other people are sacrificed on the altar, whether it's the altar of the Iranian theocracy, the altar of the United States, political system, other people fight it out on behalf of them. The thing is, we need to be able to talk to our neighbours and friends, not just listen to radio programs about what is ahead. We're no longer in a situation where we as a country are isolated. That's right, isolated from war. We can send people to Afghanistan, no consequence in Australia. We can send people to Vietnam, no consequence in Australia, apart obviously from the people who die. The Australians who die. We can send people, to Iraq, no consequences for Australia. The type of sabre rattling we hear today when we see Chris Bowen talking about a rules-based order, the Chinese government, the type of sabre rattling we see today has exceptionally important consequences, because even a city as isolated as Melbourne, the end of the world, I've forgotten that 56 movie, what it was called, the fact is that we are now all targets. Every single major city in this country is a target, especially those areas which are part of the United States expansion, which we've seen, rapid expansion in this country. So, prepping you for war, grooming us for war. Let's get all out there. Let's get all nationalistic. Let's wave the flag. Let's tell them how great we are. Let's get ready, but let's remember the old adage in World War One. There was an old industrial workers of the world adage. Remember, the industrial workers of the world were against World War One, one of the few groups initially, and they talked about, about how the fact is that it was only the children of the working classes that were sent out there. Everybody else remained at home. And that's the thing about most of these wars, as we see in the Ukraine, as we've seen in Gaza. It's fought by workers at either end of a bayonet. But the difference today is the weapons of mass destruction which are available to nation states are so extraordinarily destructive that we have to be very careful when we jump on that bandwagon that they're preparing for us. We've got to be very careful when we start believing the propaganda, as we're groomed to accept the fact that possibly tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands, would die in such a atrocity. I know it sounds far-fetched, but remember, what is far-fetched today can be reality tomorrow. You listen to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Gaza. Well, Mr. Biden is getting himself ready for re-election in November. He needs to organise a permanent ceasefire, and he's trying to hold back his little dogs in the Israeli government. So we'll see what happens in the next few days. I know a lot of people don't think anything will happen, but I feel that Hamas has reached a situation where they will need to accept the current thing. Whether the Israeli government accepts it, that's a different matter, because obviously that'll be the sticking point, because obviously the people of Israel and the people of Palestine and the people of Gaza, especially the people of Gaza, are beginning to understand that this war is a direct consequence of the partition in 1948. And enough people have died, and that some type of accommodation needs to be made, as we see in Ukraine, where there will be a peace conference soon, and the Ukrainian president is hoping that the Chinese will become involved. So, let's move on. Prohibition. Now, I understand that over the last few days, people have been talking about, the prohibition on drugs in this country. And, Australians love their drugs, especially legal ones. We're one of the biggest consumers in the world. All you've got to do is look at the sewage and you can see the amount of meth and heroin and, party drugs that appear in waste disposal around the country. Now, obviously, billions of dollars have been used to control the drug problem. Unfortunately, the war on drugs has been one of the biggest failures in this country's history. And what it's done, it's created an exceptionally difficult situation. Today, as I speak, 60, possibly 70% of everybody in a prison in this country is there for a drug-related crime. Whether it's through the use of violence to feed a habit, whether it's through, the fact that they've been captured with drugs. So that's an extraordinary amount of people in jail. No wonder the South Australian government is expanding their major prison at, I've forgotten, Yatala in Adelaide. They put in a few $1 billion to expand the prison. And the fact is that while we continue a prohibition policy, we will continue to feed the drug lords. See, drug production is the ultimate capitalism, the ultimate private investment of private profit. If things go well and you import shit, or you even manufacture the shit, and you flog the shit, you can make a lot of profit, a huge amount of profit, because it's illegal, you see. It's illegal. So no wonder we have the growth of criminal elements which are more than happy to use violence to protect the little criminal empires growing rapidly in this country. At the same time, the human misery which can be caused by many drugs, that human misery continues to mount because so much resources are going to prohibition that resources are being denied to people with a drug addiction who wish to overcome that drug addiction. Now you try to get a place in a drying out centre anywhere in this country, especially in the public sector, and you will find that just not there. Because so much money has gone into prohibition. Now people talk about, decriminalising drug use. Well, decriminalising drug use goes part of the way. But what we need to be looking at is legalising drug use. That's right. We legalise tobacco, we've legalised vapes, we legalise alcohol. Obviously there are problems associated with each and every one of those activities, but we treat the issues as a health issue. And apart from the illegal tobacco trade, because cigarettes are so expensive because of excise currently, that the criminals have moved in because you can make a buck. And remember, criminality is about a private investment for private profit. It's not about Robin Hood. None of these bastards are Robin Hoods. They're about, maximising their profits and creating at the expense of human misery. But you're not going to resolve this human misery through prohibition. I'm a great believer in legalisation. Legalise it. Treat the problems of health issue. Once a prohibited substance is legalised, you remove, that's right, you remove the financial incentive for the criminal underworld to be involved. And they're only involved where there's a buck to be made. That's the great thing about criminality. It is the purest form of capitalism you can imagine. Private investment for maximal private profit, irrespective of the human waste that is concerned. So we can continue the war on drugs, destroy lives, incarcerate people, fine them, not have enough facilities to treat addiction. Or we can actually go that step further and go from decriminalisation to legalisation and deal with any issues as a health issue, not a policing matter. And I'm sure the police would be very, very happy to not be involved in the waste of time, which they're involved in now, trying to keep King Canute, like, the drug waves from crashing on this continent. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. My name is Joseph Ascana. You can access this program as a podcast. The podcast is 3cr.org.au, 3cr.org.au. So what do Australia and India have in common? Well, I don't know. Of course I do. Well, maybe I think I do. Well, I just had an election. We're going to have an election next year, I think around March. But see, they've both moved in the privatisation, deregulation, corporatisation, globalisation, mantra. Now, obviously, the current Prime Minister has been most likely re-elected for a third term with a greatly reduced minority, I think created minority government, has been pushing this on behalf of the Indian population, using Hindu nationalism as a calling card, calling card. But what's happened? Well, the same thing that has happened in Australia, and the same thing that's happened around the world. As we deregulate, corporatise, globalise and privatise, guess what? The rich get richer, the poorer get poorer. And the last Indian election was based on that principle. Why is there high unemployment? Why is poverty increasing? Obviously, some have done very well. Like in Australia, we've got an 8% investment class that has done exceptionally well. But the great majority don't. That's what we have in common. If you follow the same philosophy, the same ideology, you get the same results. And the difference between Australia and India is the people in India are beginning to understand that these policies are unfit for human consumption, and that things need to move in a different direction. And that's why I say the ground in this country is pregnant for change. And that hope, the desire and expectation that change will come, egalitarian change will come, is becoming part and parcel of discussion. Not part and parcel of organisation, but part and parcel of discussion in this country. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. As I said before, the program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. Now, while I'm talking, I'd just like to remind our local listeners in Victoria that next week is 3CR Radiothon Day, where we're trying to raise money to keep 3CR independent of government, bureaucracy, corporations and the private sector. And we can only do that through your support. I can assure you, you won't hear this program on the government-gelded ABC or the corporate-owned media. It's been broadcasting for over 45 years on Community Radio 3CR. The fact is that this particular radio station functions because of the support of its listeners. So I'm asking listeners in this state, and obviously anywhere else in Australia that are listening to this program, courtesy of the Community Radio Network, to donate to the 3CR Radio Fund via the Anarchist World this week. We're trying to raise $12,000 to $15,000 next week. But the good news for our listeners outside of Victoria is that I'll be doing a special program for the rest of Australia, because obviously in the rest of Australia, you listen to this program via Community Radio Network at a community radio station. Your community radio station needs your support to continue to function and exist, free of government control. And as they say, he or she who pays the piper calls the tune. And if you pay the piper, you call the tune. But the beauty of donating to the 3CR Radio Fund is you can get a legal, legitimate tax deduction. That's right, like the rich and infamous, you can, hold a dinner party and say, look at me. I donated to the 3CR Radio Fund, courtesy of the Anarchist World this week, and guess what? I got a legal, legitimate tax deduction. Gina Reinhardt, eat your heart out. Well, basically, it's obviously things are difficult, but that's the time that we need support. Let's move on. Now, I don't want to scare you, but, although I'm over 70, I'm nearly 73, I've, I make it my business to keep abreast of developments. Being a doctor for 49 years, you like to keep yourself abreast of development. And I attended a very interesting lecture on Sunday about endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDC, endocrine disrupting chemicals. It's a new field of medical research, medical and health research. There have been mumblings among people for generations about endocrine disrupting chemicals, but we've now got to the situation where we can actually pinpoint through scientific analysis the extraordinary impacts that these endocrine disrupting chemicals are having on each and every one of us on the planet. We absorb them through the skin, we ingest them through our mouths, we absorb them from the air, we inhale them through the air. So what is an endocrine disrupting chemical? Look, I will tell you the official medical definition, and then I'll put it into plain English. An endocrine disrupting chemical is an exogenous agent that interferes with synthesis, secretion, transport, binding, and action or elimination of natural hormones in the body, which are responsible for the maintenance of hemostasis, reproduction, development, and or behaviour. So basically, they are chemicals that are part and parcel of our everyday life, which have an impact on our endocrine system. Our endocrine system, to a significant degree, are messengers which regulate many of our basic functions like reproduction, development, and they can affect in the womb, they can affect outside the womb, they can affect the young, and they can affect the elderly, and they can affect everybody in between. Okay, so that's what an endocrine disrupting chemical is. Now, just in case you're going to, kind of jump up and down and get all excited that there's nothing we can do about this, the fact is that the more research you do, the more you as an individual can do. Now, we think currently, not believe, but think, that close to 1,500 chemicals in the environment are endocrine disrupting. And endocrine disrupting exposure is associated, this is things that have been proven scientifically, this is not a belief system, are associated to cancer, diabetes, obesity, neurological impairments like ADHD and autism, and reproductive disorders and infertility. That's a huge number of impairments. And if you're into research, medical research, the fascinating thing is that it's regional specific. Different parts of the world, depending on what chemicals they're exposed to, have different rates of disease. And in Western society, and we're part of that Western framework, breast cancer, one in seven women listening to this program will develop breast cancer during their lifetime. Diabetes, at least 40% of us will develop diabetes. Obesity, well, look around you. I'm just looking at myself. The rates of asthma, autism and ADHD have increased dramatically in the last 30 to 40 years. So this is a huge field. So what I'd like to do today is actually concentrate on a particular endocrine disruptive chemical, and it's called BPA. You like that? BPA. What's BPA? BPA is Bisphenol A. That's right, Bisphenol. And it's been used since the 1950s, and it is found in packaging of all types, tin, plastic, the list goes on and on. And it has a huge impact on fertility. And we are now seeing decreased fertility rates in the Western world, not just in terms of people not wanting children because of economic circumstances, but 1 in 6 are now approaching assistance as far as fertility issues are concerned. So the 6 major categories of these endocrine disrupting chemicals are biocides, which are all the pesticides, bisphenols, which I'm speaking about, nitrophenols, parabens, PFAS, which we all know, and ultraviolet filters. Now, it's fascinating that the major impact of bisphenol is on children between the ages of 2 and 4, where they are exposed to 2,000 times more levels than anybody else. So what can you do? What can you do? You drink out of glass containers, not plastic, not tin, glass. It reduces the amount of bisphenols extraordinarily. Simple thing you can do. Plastic bottles, forget about them. If it's hardened plastic, fine. Never use plastic in a microwave, which we all tend to do, because these chemicals can be cumulative because we take them every day. Think about it. Look it up. BPA. BPA. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. This program is brought to you, as I said, from 3CR. We'll be doing a special radiophone program next week. Please listen in. The rest of the country is spared from the inanity and of the radiophone program. I'll be doing a special pre-record for the rest of the country. Thank you once again. You can leave messages on 0439 395 489. Facebook page, Joseph Toscano, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, pibci.net. YouTube channel, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. The list goes on and on. You can even write to us at Post Office Box 20, Parkville 3052. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station, courtesy of the Community Radio Network. Listen in next week. All I can say is keep a smile on your face while you're trying to survive.
Evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction.
An analysis you'll never hear anywhere else. Anarchist World this week. Australia's sacred cow slaughterhouse. 10 a.m. every Wednesday. Listen to the Anarchist World this week for an up-to-date analysis of local, national and international events.
Poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, yeah.
3CR Radiothon 2024. Sound on for solidarity.
You've been listening to a podcast produced at 3CR Community Radio. It's Radiothon time. This year, we need to raise $275,000 to keep the station going. Any amount you can afford makes a big difference. It's so easy to donate. Head to 3cr.org.au/donate. We rely on the community's support. Thanks for listening.